Imprisonment can be a frightening prospect. Being sealed behind bars and subject to the cold walls surrounding you is enough to drive many people mad. But what happens when your perceptions of those walls around you itself are warped? What if the reality that you know is on the brink, ready to tear at the seams, and you don't know whether or not you're dreaming or if you're awake? How do you confront the fact that you're a prisoner inside of your own mind? That is the premise of Inmates, a psychological horror game by David Andresian and published by Iceberg Interactive. Nominally, it's a horror adventure game. In reality, it plays more like a walking simulator along the lines of something like Canarium or Layers of Fear. That means that Inmates has a strict de-emphasis on inventory management, encounters with enemies, and, at least in its own case, puzzle solving. In fact, there's no inventory to speak of whatsoever. The only usable objects in the game, aside from doors and occasional puzzles, are matches that can temporarily illuminate the darkest of corners. Every other object is tied into a scripted sequence and can only be interacted with when the game necessitates it. I like to think of this sort of game as something like a haunted house. It's more interested in a dark and foreboding atmosphere and presents what is essentially interactive fiction. There's no real danger, and the game doesn't expect anything out of you except for making your way through it and getting towards the exit. And much like a haunted house, it's the game's ambiance and atmosphere that does all the heavy lifting. This is something that Inmates does pretty well. There's a lot of creepy stuff going on in the background that could send a shiver down your spine and keep you on your toes while you wander about. The emptiness of a rotting, derelict prison is accented by a lot of the stuff the game throws at you. Lightning and thunder will randomly strike outside of the building. Rogue gas pipes will burst as you walk by them, and the sound of your own footsteps and heavy breathing will drown out those unsettling and faint noises that occasionally play in the background, so quiet you can't make out what they are. All these elements come together and really do a great job of driving in the spookiness of the game's environment and bring it to life. Even if that heavy breathing can get annoying at times. And while the game isn't completely void of jump scares, it doesn't over-rely on them either. It's a game that recognizes that its greatest strength is through building up the environment around the player, as well as emphasizing the protagonist's relationship to that environment. Mostly. Some of the game's ideas I don't think work out as well as the developer intended them to. But this also raises another issue, and that's the problem that all this focus on environmental storytelling actually loses a lot of its luster very quickly. Much of the horror and the terror that the game tries to instill doesn't last very long, and that's entirely based on the way that Inmates is constructed as a game. You see, Inmates is very short. I finished the story in about an hour and 40 minutes, even with much of the padding towards the end. The game's Steam page estimates that it'll take you about 3 to 4 hours to complete, but I don't see how, frankly. Now, its length isn't a problem in and of itself. It took me roughly the same amount of time to finish Inmates as it did the Whistleblower DLC for Outlast. But the difference between those two games, and why I found Outlast to be a more horrifying experience throughout its entire run, and why Inmates wasn't, is the way that Outlast continually pushes the player into the unknown. You're constantly entering new places that maintain the same level of tension and fear, while being uncertain of what you're going to be facing up ahead. In the case of Inmates, a good 90% of the game is set entirely in the same small, confined area. You can see the entirety of the game's layout in just over a half hour of gameplay, and once you've seen what it has to offer, much of that sense of mystery, that fear of the unknown, is stripped away. You become familiar with your small surroundings very quickly, and familiarity, in this case, breeds ease and reduces tension. There's only so many times you can pass by the same cells before that sensation of being disturbed dulls, especially if they don't pose any threat to you. It creates a dissonance between the player and the character. It's a large reason as to why I didn't share the same feeling of dread when the game told me to return to the basement a second time that the game's protagonist did.
Shit, not the basement again?
I also found the game's puzzles to be disappointing. There's only a small handful of them, and none of them are particularly difficult. They're all pretty basic and straightforward. It's a shame, because I thought this really could have been an opportunity for the game to shine, particularly given its short length and very small setting. Beyond that, the game's biggest flaw is its pacing and the way that it pads itself out towards its finale. Rather than using the environment to its advantage and using it to slowly peel back the layers of the game's plot, it instead dumps its exposition onto the player in a single scene. The mystery of the prison is all revealed here, and frankly, it's underwhelming to say the least. This is perhaps the biggest wasted opportunity that Inmates had, and this was a major disappointment as a result. This is followed by what is perhaps the most painfully tedious slog I've ever experienced in a walking simulator, or perhaps any video game period. There's a maze section, and a poorly done one at that. You need to find a door at the end, all while being hounded by enemies that, if they touch you, force you to start the maze all over again. Trying to discern which direction is the correct one is a painful game of trial and error, as there's nothing unique about this section that can even give you a hint as where you're supposed to go. And when you do finally reach the end, you're rewarded with another series of mazes. These ones with no enemies, but with movement speed that is slowed to a crawl. Getting through this part of the game is laborious and dull, and I hated it. One of these mazes even has invisible walls, which are certain to frustrate you if you weren't already feeling a level of frustration. I'm going to give the game a benefit of the doubt and assume that the missing walls are intentional and they're supposed to represent the breaking down of the protagonist's psyche or something rather than graphical glitches, but it doesn't make this section any less of a chore to get through. In fact, this one is probably the worst one out of them all, since the inability to see where you're going coupled with a slow walking speed is excruciating. The only way I managed to even get past this section was by accidentally exploiting a bug I had discovered when I first started playing the game. A bug that actually forced me to start my playthrough over again because it made progression impossible. Inmates uses a single save file that auto-saves at certain checkpoints. However, it also has a save and quit option on the menu, which implies that quitting the game will allow you to continue your progress from the spot that you're in, or at least the spot that you're near when you re-enter the game. I had quit the game before interacting with an object that was supposed to deliver a bit of exposition and let me continue on my way. But when I reloaded the save, I found myself in the hallway outside of the area that I needed to be in. This was a problem because not interacting with that object meant that certain doors in the area, namely the doors that I needed to bypass in order to allow me to backtrack into that room, were locked with no way to get by them. I was stuck in this corridor, unable to do anything other than start the game over. The same happy accident popped its head up again during that maze sequence, much to my delight this time. While wandering the maze, I quit to the main menu to change one of the game's options, because the game doesn't let you change them while you're in the game itself, and when I reloaded that save, I found myself unexpectedly watching the game's final scenes. Bully for me. These technical issues alone are enough for me to say that Inmates is probably not worth your time or your money. But even if that bug wasn't present, Inmates is still hard to recommend. It's a very mediocre game in its execution, and it doesn't do anything that makes it stand out from the pack, even among other walking simulators, even among other horror walking simulators. Other games already do similar things to Inmates, but those games do them better, and when you jump from one to the other, it only makes this game's flaws stand out all the more. Ultimately, that's the biggest problem that Inmates has. It's an average game that's brought down a few notches by poor design and by some real big mechanical failures. Maybe these issues will be dealt with future updates, but until the game gets a couple of patches to really give it some polish, I'd say avoid this one this coming Halloween.